Hello, this is AJ Camacho with WRGW's PINDROP. Joining me today is a man who was often considered for many years to be the top State Department hand in Southeast Asia, Scot Marciel, who, among other things, for 4 years held a position as the United States ambassador to Myanmar, the country we're focusing on today. He is now a fellow at Stanford University. Ambassador Marciel, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to go first towards you left in 2020 as the ambassador to Myanmar. Less than a year after you left, we saw this military coup. Oftentimes, historians have said it seems very predictable that a coup can happen by the environment a nation is in. At the point that you left, did you foresee something like that happening? Was that completely off your radar? Where, of course, hindsight is 2020, but in the moment, did you see something like that as potential, having the potential for occurring?
I would say that I saw it as a possibility, but didn't expect it. There had been for several years tension between the democratically elected government led by Aung San Suu Kyi and the military, which still had tremendous power. So the tension wasn't a surprise, but I think many of us, including me, assumed that because the military was still quite powerful under the Constitution, that it didn't need to stage a coup to protect itself.
Okay. Any particular reasons? Obviously, our knowledge is limited as to what the thinking is going on within the military. What seem to have been the driving factors behind the military decision to stage a coup? Because as you said, plenty of countries, Brazil might be an example, have this clear, distinct separation, and the military is still quite powerful, but there's not inherently a need to stage a coup over the entire government. What do you think might have swayed the military towards these actions?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First, the military in Myanmar has long seen itself as the essential institution preserving the unity of the country. So they have a rather high opinion of themselves that's not widely shared within the country, but it doesn't stop them from feeling that way. Second, I think there was probably concern that a second term of the national unity government, another 5 years, would be used to chip away at their legal and political power, but also at their economic power, which is pretty important to them. That plus probably a certain amount of ego on the part of the head of the military, Min Aung Hlaing, who really wants to be president, and perhaps felt some personal ambition combined with anger that his false claims of electoral fraud were not being taken seriously.
You mentioned there one of the concerns might have even been economic. The United States did sanction in, I believe it was 2019, Min Aung Hlaing, among other officials within the Myanmar military for the genocide against the Rohingya. But this came about 3 years after the genocide had started. Again, hindsight is always 2020. Do you think, looking back, that the United States response was roughly appropriate? Do you think we could have done more, should have done less? Obviously, some of this might have to do with your opinions on sanctions, which is always a topic of controversy.
Yeah. Well, during the Rohingya crisis, and I mean, the Rohingya crisis didn't emerge out of nowhere. The Rohingya were facing basically an apartheid-like situation before the crisis erupted into massive violence. And a lot of people, including the United States government and our embassy, were working very hard trying to improve the situation for the Rohingya before the crisis. Once the crisis hit, the whole country of Myanmar almost entirely either was supportive of military action against the Rohingya in response to some minor attacks carried out by a small number of Rohingya, or didn't believe the allegations, the very credible and true allegations of widespread human rights abuses, excuse me. Anyway, there was a lot of effort to try to end the violence against the Rohingya and improve their situation by the U.S. and many others. Obviously that didn't succeed. So I think there's plenty of room for criticism and second guessing of everything we did. I think that's perfectly appropriate. That said, Sanctions, people have an exaggerated opinion of the influence of sanctions often, particularly in a case like Myanmar, where there's not really that big of an intersection between the military's money and the U.S. economy. I mean, they didn't have money in New York or investments, or were doing a lot of trade or anything like that. So sanctions are useful symbolically, and sometimes they can squeeze a little bit, but sanctions were never going to be the answer.
So you already partially answered this last question a little bit. But there was recently a report released by an international parliamentary inquiry, which included 8 international legislatures, including Representative Ilhan Omar in the United States. And it concluded with a recommendation that coordinated sanctions and arms embargoes, and recognizing the national unity government as the legitimate authority in Myanmar, could prove to be what they called a deciding factor in the continuation of military rule there. How do you rate that recommendation? And in general, do you view this military rule as solidified, or do you think it is very much in challenge over the coming years to maintain its position?
Right. And I actually testified to that international parliamentary inquiry, and I wasn't deeply involved in it, but I did testify. So I think it adds a lot of value. I think those recommendations are sound. How realistic they are, because the countries that have the most economic influence vis-a-vis the generals are those that are least likely to participate in sanctions or an arms embargo. So the countries that would join an arms embargo generally aren't supplying arms. So I agree in theory with it, and I think it's worth pursuing, but we should have realistic expectations. As to the second part of the question, no, I don't think military rule is at all solidified. What we've seen is nearly the entire nation rise up against the military, the attempted military coup, because people saw not only their freedom, but their opportunity taken away by this coup. They've experienced military rule. They know what it's like. It's not just repressive, it also tends to be very bad for the economy, healthcare system, education system, etc. So right now you have both armed conflict and peaceful protests and other movements against the military. So the military has sort of ostensible control over the main levers of power, but it's under a lot of pressure and has very little support within the country.
Lastly, before I let you go, Ambassador, you, I believe next year, are coming out with a book called Imperfect Partners on the United States relationship with Southeast Asia. I've read the description of it. It looks very good. Obviously, I've not read a full copy for obvious reasons. It's not out yet. What can you tell us about what I mean, I don't want you to have to spoil the whole book here, but what can you give us as sort of a preview of what you're making, what you're presenting in this book, whether it's an interesting anecdote, what your thesis, or maybe how your book and its advice and what you mention in it pertains to these crises as we're seeing in Southeast Asia, and how the United States relationship with that region is indeed a bit on and off. It's not completely solidified, I would say.
Right. What I try to do in this is use a little bit of my own personal experience, although it's not at all a memoir. I did some of my personal experience, but also a lot of research to look at U.S. relations with the key countries and of the region, as well as ASEAN, over the last 30, 40 years up to today. And basically, as you said, talked about some of the disappointments both ways, with the U.S. tending to be disappointed that Southeast Asia hasn't moved forward on democracy and human rights as much as we would like. Many Southeast Asians being disappointed with what they see as sort of episodic U.S. engagement and a tendency to lecture. But in the book, I go into detail about U.S. relations with the Philippines and Thailand, the normalization with Vietnam and subsequent progress in that relationship, the relations with Indonesia through its democratic transition, and quite a bit of time on Myanmar. And in the end, my thesis or my conclusion is that despite the disappointments, it's in the interest of the United States and of Southeast Asia to strengthen the relationship, not against China. That's really important. China's going to be there. All these countries need to have good relations with China. But the more the United States and Southeast Asia work together with a positive agenda that's not about China, that brings benefits of its own, but it also gives all of those countries some maneuvering room vis-a-vis China so that they maintain full freedom of action. And I think that's really the key to looking at it.
Very interesting thesis. My own grandmother is from Manila, but has lived in the United States in Guam for a couple of decades now. And, you know, she tells me a very similar thing. You know, in improving these relations, I'm tired of it being about China and how that relates to the Philippines for the U.S.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much, Ambassador, for your time. Ambassador Scot Marciel was the United States ambassador to Myanmar, among many other positions he held as a Foreign Service officer in Southeast Asia. He is now a fellow at Stanford, and this book coming out next year is called Imperfect Partners. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.